Shalom, I'm Rabbi Michael Panitz of Temple Israel of Norfolk, Virginia. Happy to be speaking to you from the pulpit of my congregation. This message is entitled, The Right Place and the Wrong Place for the Ten Commandments. My title is intentionally provocative. Can there even be a wrong place for the Ten Commandments? My answer is, alas, there can be. But to get to that answer, first we have to prepare the ground. This week, a confluence of our classic Jewish calendar and current events has put the Ten Commandments squarely in focus. On our calendar is the holiday of Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, when we read the Exodus iteration of the Ten Commandments in synagogue. More exactly, we do not call that text the Ten Commandments because the first assertion, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God, may or may not be interpreted as a commandment. We call that text Aseret HaDiborot, the 10 words, meaning 10 foundational divine utterances. The current events are the fracas in Texas over a Texas State Senate bill to display the Ten Commandments, that is to say, the Protestant Christian version of the translation of that text, in Texas schools. The bill passed the state Senate in April, but failed in the State House of Representatives this week. The members of that legislative chamber allowed a deadline to pass without voting, and thus the bill died, without any of the members risking the wrath of evangelical voters by voting against it. Conservative Christians have argued that the Ten Commandments should be displayed in public school classrooms ever since that practice was disallowed by the Supreme Court in the 1960s. In the superheated rhetoric of the culture wars that convulse our country, that camp has sought to draw a line between the absence of the Ten Commandments icon from classroom walls and such social ills as mass shootings in schools and out-of-wedlock pregnancies. I would like to frame the issue for you, speaking from my perspective as a rabbi and as a trained historian. As a rabbi, I believe that the Ten Commandments belong in our hearts. They belong in our minds. They belong in our churches and synagogues and parochial schools. They ought to guide our actions. But to go from that assertion to the conclusion that they belong on the public school classroom wall is both unsound and dangerous. The conclusion is unsound because it rests on an untenable assumption, namely that a particular icon will have the kind of power that its proponents claim. A single glance at any untidy classroom space, a single visit to any unruly middle school classroom ought to convince a fair-minded observer that signs promoting neatness and good classroom citizenship cannot work like magic. But let us not caricature the argument for the inclusion of that famous text, sacred to many, in that public space. It is wrong for a deeper reason. The argument is of a piece with the posture that we call Christian nationalism. That means many things, but at its core it claims that Americans are a Christian nation, and that Christian Americans are entitled or even mandated to control the public space of this country. Of late, the U.S. Supreme Court has granted victories to that basic worldview. In its 2022 ruling in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, the High Court ruled that a Christian high school football coach was unfairly deprived of his free exercise of religion when the school board fired him for leading post-game prayers with a number of students on the football field. The school board suspended him because it feared being sued for violating the provision in the First Amendment prohibiting the government from establishing a religion. Coach Kennedy lost at the circuit court and appellate levels, but the Supreme Court reversed those lower court rulings. As a teacher with over 4 decades of experience teaching high school students, I found it ludicrous for the coach to argue that his prayers were purely private. The history of post-game prayers in the kind of Christianity practiced by this coach is one of the majority faith being practiced in public without sensitivity to the diversity of American religious life. For the kids on those teams, football is akin to religion anyway. And when it is combined with traditional religion, the mix becomes all the more potent. A coach who sets the example to his students by kneeling in the secular equivalent of sacred space, the 50-yard line, is not performing a merely private act. He is gesturally inviting his impressionable charges to join him. There are not many aspiring adolescent athletes worried about satisfying the coach who would risk disappointing him by sitting out that bonding ritual, let alone by voicing religious dissent to that practice. The Supreme Court is filled with smart people. For them to construe the coach's action as more about free exercise of religion than it is about the prohibition against the establishment of religion tells me that they wish to push the boundaries between church and state back to an era when the religion of the Protestant American majority was more of an unchallenged owner of the public square than has been the case for the past half-century. Against this legal background, the Texas State Senate tried to reconquer the classroom for Christ, their impression of Christ. The Ten Commandments were their weapon of choice in that front of the culture war. The Texas bill goes beyond the Kennedy case because whereas at least notionally Coach Kennedy was supposedly allowing his students to sit out, the students are required to remain in the classrooms in Texas where the Ten Commandments were to be posted. What of the non-Protestant Christians in Texas? They're essentially being told that their culture is not worthy of presentation at the level of the established church. What of the Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews, and Wiccans, and atheists who've contributed to the state and society of Texas? They're being told that they don't count. That is the message of Christian nationalism. Most fundamentally, the Ten Commandment warriors are confusing the two meanings of the word public. It is not sufficient for them that society, public in one sense, should heed the good guidance of the 10 words. They want the state, public in a different sense, to enforce their particular version of religion. I want my 10 Commandments to be a guide, not a goad. I want the laws presented in my faith to guide my conscience, not to coerce me with the force of secular state statutes. The 10 words begin with God saying, Anochi, I, and end with God saying, Re'echa, your neighbor. In our world today, where neighbors cherish different traditions about God, it is best for us to remember that one cannot fulfill the 10 words if one does not have a basic respect for one's neighbors in all of their diversity. With the Jewish festival of Shavuot approaching, I will celebrate my tradition's dating of the giving of the 10 Commandments. But I would not seek to force my tradition upon my neighbor. That would be a betrayal, not a fulfillment of the 10 words. And I urge us to fulfill those words, as we say in our tradition, for they are our life and the length of our days. Amen.